I'm Dr. Yoni Witten, and for the last 15 years, I've made it my mission to help as many people as possible to get themselves out of chronic pain. This journey has been both extremely challenging and extremely rewarding. And part of the reason why working with chronic pain is such a challenge is because it's difficult to say to a person, this is the one factor that you need to fix in order to resolve your chronic pain, because more often than not, people that are stuck in these long-standing pain patterns have multiple factors that are contributing to their problem. This week, I got to sit down with functional medicine practitioner Dr. Tim Jackson, and we talked about the autonomic nervous system, specifically the balance between your rest and digest system and your fight or flight system. He had some really interesting thoughts on why so many people nowadays are stuck in chronic pain, some simple things that a person can do to detect if they're trending towards sympathetic or fight or flight dominance, as well as some easy to implement strategies that can help shift you away from that chronic stress response and decrease pain levels in the body. If you've been struggling with chronic pain for a long time and traditional methods of addressing it have not worked for you, you need to see this interview. Well, I have for us today Dr. Tim Jackson. He has an undergraduate degree in chemistry from Wake Forest University, and he has his Doctor of Physical Therapy degree, which he received in 2009. And he branched out from the traditional route that most physical therapists take with orthopedics and physical medicine, and branched off into functional medicine and environmental medicine. So, Tim, thank you so much for being here, and tell us why you made that switch, because it's unusual for people with a physical therapy background.
Thanks for having me. I went to undergrad and I did well academically, and I was completing my requirements. I did a preceptorship at the Wake Forest School of Medicine, and one of the residents, he was really into exercise like I was, and so he pulled me aside and he said, I think you're going to be unhappy at an MD program. Like, you can certainly do it academically, but you're going to be miserable. So just get a ticket to play the game. And, at that time, if I had to do it over again, I'd probably get a chiropractic degree. But at that time, what made the most sense to me, because I was very allopathic minded, was to get my DPT. And, like many chiropractors who don't really adjust anymore, they do more of the functional wellness. That's sort of what I've done. And I've noticed a lot of musculoskeletal trends had internal imbalances that were manifesting externally.
Interesting. So explain to me exactly what that means as you intend it, because when somebody says that they're a functional medicine practitioner, it's kind of a nebulous term, and it can mean a lot of different things. So explain to me and explain to my audience what it means to be a functional medicine practitioner.
So functional medicine, and I really started doing it before that term was in vogue, but basically you're looking at root causes. And I know that's very cliche, but you're running lab work and getting to the source of the problem. That doesn't mean you don't provide palliative or acute symptom relief. That's certainly needed, but our long-term goal needs to be, let's resolve the biochemical blocks or hiccups, if you will, and let the body do its thing on its own.
Very interesting. Yeah. So my audience is primarily pain-centric, and a lot of people that are part of my program are dealing with chronic pain. And as well as I do that chronic pain can have many different root causes or many different things that are contributing to the problem. So what factors do you see playing into that on kind of like a broad overview? And then what does your approach look like when you're examining somebody with a chronic pain condition?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, usually it's not one factor, assuming that it's not trauma or an acute incident, but you have several issues such as dysbiosis in the gut, which is an imbalance of the good and bad bacteria. And the reason that plays a role is because if you have inflammation in the gut, you're going to have systemic inflammation throughout the body. And if you have inflammation, you're going to have pain at some point. And so you can't have pain without inflammation, right? And so, addressing that inflammation and looking at the 30,000-foot view, there's so many things that factor into inflammation, from like the gut that I mentioned to neurotransmitter imbalances specifically related to pain. So two of our neurotransmitters are glutamate and GABA, and they're kind of on a seesaw. Glutamate is excitatory, and we need it for learning and memory, but too much makes us anxious and contributes to pain and even addiction. Mm-hmm. GABA is our calming neurotransmitter. It's like our natural Vicodin. And so we need a good balance of those two. And today, most people have too much glutamate and too little GABA. And there can be many reasons for that. But having a skewed ratio where glutamate's up here and GABA's down here certainly amplifies pain and the perception of pain. You can have things as far out as mold toxicity that contributes to systematic inflammation and systemic inflammation, along with shutting down mitochondrial health, which is, the batteries of the cells. And if you can't make energy, when we hear the term energy, we think, oh, workout, exercise, but our daily functions, just like liver detoxification, the heart pumping, sleeping, those are all energy dependent processes. And so the more of a decrease you have in your mitochondrial energy production, the more functions are going to decrease in your body. So I tell people to think of an Olympic level athlete as having perfect mitochondria. Think of someone who's in the ICU with multi-system organ failure as having dysfunctional mitochondria. And so the more organ systems you have involved in your symptomology, the more likely there's a mitochondrial component. And so all of those things, certainly play a role. Hormonal imbalances play a role. And without getting too deep, basically homeostasis, or a state of balance, is where we want to be. And then you have anabolic and catabolic over here. Usually when I say anabolic, people think I'm referring to steroids, but anabolic, as you know, just means regenerative, restorative. So sleep is very anabolic. Sure. So hormones like growth hormone, testosterone are anabolic. Sure. Hormones like cortisol, our primary stress hormones, are catabolic. And so if you have really high levels of catabolic hormones and low levels of anabolic hormones, you're going to be more likely to experience pain.
Okay, so we're getting into hormones there. Why don't, that's a kind of a perfect segue. Why don't we talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system and the two branches there, and then we'll jump into that.
So, like as we learned in school, and most people learned in high school biology, our internal organs have dual innervation. So the autonomic nervous system is the major heading, and it breaks down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay. The sympathetic is the fight or flight. So think about running from a tiger. And the parasympathetic is the feed and breathe. So that's when you eat, digest, and reproduce. And can you relate those back, Tim, to the two hormonal profiles that you described a minute ago? Yeah. So if your levels of cortisol and other stress hormones are too high, you're going to be more likely to be in a sympathetic dominant state. Okay. And that means, like you might have a hyperactive startle response. Yes. So someone drops a pin and you jump. Sure. And so those responsive have gotten magnified, even though, certain stressors may have been removed from the body. Okay. And then the flip side of the equation? Yeah, the flip side of the equation, parasympathetic. So you always want a healthy balance. Sure. And be able to sort of, I give people the analogy of think about walking your dog. He might see a squirrel or a bird and chase it. So that's the sympathetic side. But then 2 minutes later, he's forgotten about it. Okay. And he's relaxing. And that's the parasympathetic side. Okay. And so ideally, no organ is ever 100% sympathetic and 0% parasympathetic or vice versa.
Mhm.
It's always a mixture. Unfortunately, in today's society, more people are locked into a sympathetic dominant state, which means like their nervous system is perceiving the situation as if they're constantly stressed and running from a tiger. And so it can be a multitude and a number of stressors that contribute to that state. But, we'll talk about here in a little bit ways to rebalance the nervous system, because you don't want to be stuck in either side. But, if you have to pick one, I would say the parasympathetic side.
So let me ask you, you said that a bunch of people nowadays are stuck in this sympathetic dominant state. Before we get into ways of getting out of it, help people understand why people, specifically in modern society, are trending towards sympathetic dominance.
So the entire sympathetic cascade of events can be triggered by inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
So we know there's a million causes of inflammation, but also stress or the perception of stress. So we can have the same thing happen to both of us, but I might cognitively restructure it in a positive manner. And you may say, oh man, it's the end of the world. And so we get opposite responses.
Well, that's exactly right. So you're talking about like internal dialogue.
Right.
So before we started the webinar, you were telling me about what just happened with your vehicle.
Yes.
And there's two very different stories that you can tell yourself, and that will result rather in two completely different sets of physiology inside of your body.
Right.
That's a really important point, and I don't think a lot of people talk about that, is things that are actually happening to us or our perception of things that are happening to us. So keep going on that.
Yeah. So what I tell people is every thought has a physiological consequence.
Okay.
And, we all have these tapes or DVDs or CDs playing in our head. And you want to have positive things on those CDs. So Dr. Yoni is a great doctor. He's handsome, all those things. You want that? I don't want that on my tapes, but you want it on your tapes.
I was gonna say that's amazing. That's the same thing I say to myself.
But yeah, so the internal dialogue is super important, because you can have someone who has $8 million in the bank and is on the beach on vacation, and they can have a stressed out physiology or sympathetic dominant state. You can have someone who's fighting a war overseas who's just, cool as a cucumber.
Sure.
And their physiology is not stressed out.
Okay. So we have toxins, we have traumas, we have thoughts. What about diet? What about sleep? What about movement, which is a big component in what I teach? What do those factors play into that as well, and how so?
Yeah, so definitely your diet and nutrition play a role. So things like simple carbohydrates, sugary drinks, desserts, that's going to spike your blood sugar and then drop it. And that causes a subsequent release of cortisol and insulin. And so those insulin's anabolic, but the response after that with cortisol is catabolic, is going to be detrimental and put you in a sympathetic dominant state.
Okay, so that also relates to that, what you were saying earlier about modern society trending towards sympathetic dominance, is the typical Western diet is actually pushing us in that direction. And then what about if we get into more things that are common to Western society, like physical activity or the lack thereof with sedentary living?
Yeah, a lot of people, I hear people all the time say, I have to run just to feel normal.
Yes.
And to me, that's a red flag, because, if you have to run to feel normal, there's an imbalance somewhere or several.
Okay.
And so, they're looking for that runner's high to produce or try and balance their neurotransmitters and their endorphins. And so, they're constantly running. But if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, no matter what your belief is, we were more likely to be killed if we just ran long distances, because we're going to be encountering other tribes, other people, wild animals, etc. So we're meant to throw the javelin, throw the arrow, and go get the animal. So sprint, basically, and it's the difference between looking at a marathon runner and Simone Biles, the gymnast,
Okay.
And so, our movement plays an important role. And so if you are a chronic endurance athlete or someone who constantly runs long distances, your immune function tanks and you get into a sympathetic dominant state because your body's really not built to go for those long distances over and over again.
That's actually a really cool point. So part of my background is in kind of evolutionary physiology, what drives our physiology in terms of our ancestors' lifestyle. And my understanding of it is that the sympathetic state is necessary and we're supposed to have that, but it's supposed to take place specifically for very brief periods of time and specifically in the presence of extreme physical activity. So when you're having it take place, like you're saying, for extended periods of time, and then you pair in the absence of physical activity with that, it just multiplies out the toxicity of the situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, the opposite of that, strength training, assuming you have proper rest and recovery periods. I tell people never lift more than 2 days consecutively without a break. Especially, if you're working a traditional job. I think, from what I've researched and what I've found personally and professionally, most people can't handle more than 9 working sets of exercise if they're going to lift heavy, especially if they have kids at home and they have a job full time. So, the types of movement we do play a huge role. Now, not all movement is going to put you in a sympathetic dominant state. So, and I know your brother talks about this, but alternate nostril breathing while you're walking is good to activate the parasympathetic system.
Oh, let's definitely talk more about that as we move into this a little deeper, but getting one more factor into there, sleep. How does sleep influence parasympathetic versus sympathetic state?
Yeah, so as we all know, if when we've had a night where we didn't sleep well or went to sleep too late, it magnifies our perception of stress. So something that typically would not stress us out seems like a huge ordeal suddenly.
Yes.
And so that activates, the entire cascade and subsequent inflammation. By the same token, if you are already stressed out, it's going to be hard to go to sleep. And when you do go to sleep, you won't spend as much time in the deep stages of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And so sleep overall, is important for hormonal balance, immune function, pretty much everything on the planet. Good sleep will help. And that's when we detoxify, that's when we regenerate. And so if we're exercising, to kind of segue from the exercise part, we need good recovery and regeneration. So that deep sleep is super important for many reasons.
Absolutely. So earlier we were talking about a person's hormonal profile as a consequence of their sympathetic versus parasympathetic balance in their body. What are some symptoms or signs that a person might feel or notice that they're trending towards sympathetic dominance?
So the hyperactive startle reflex that I mentioned,
Sure.
If a window closes or a door closes or someone, speaks in a normal volume voice and you jump, that's a sign of sympathetic dominance. Lack of tear production, dry eyes, that's a sign of sympathetic dominance. Dry mouth, sympathetic dominance. It can be due to many things like medications, et cetera, especially antihistamines, but dry mouth is definitely a symptom. Okay. Inability to recover from workouts and injuries, or if you have any sort of medical procedure, those are all that you can't recover from. Those are all signs. that you're trending towards sympathetic dominance.
Mhm.
Moodiness, that's definitely one as well.
What would a person's
And
energy levels be like, Tim?
so initially, they will feel really good because they're running on cortisol. And so, if you take prescription hydrocortisone, you'll feel good, but that doesn't mean it's good for you,
Okay.
you know? And so the energy initially will be pretty high, and then later on, it'll start tanking.
Okay. You mentioned a minute ago sleep disturbance as a
Yes.
sign of that. So that would be represented by difficulty falling asleep and then difficulty staying asleep. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and even if you don't wake up during the middle of the night, when you finally wake up in the morning, you don't feel refreshed.
Okay.
So you're getting the right quantity, but not the right quality.
Okay. And then what about mental state, people trending toward negativity, like we were talking about earlier with the internal dialogue, and memory? What consequences on short-term memory?
Yes, so cortisol, our primary stress hormone, directly impacts the hippocampus in the brain. So studies have shown that the hippocampus shrinks after prolonged exposure to high levels of cortisol. And so it'll have detrimental effects on short-term memory and long-term memory, if it goes on long enough. But in the beginning, like if it's an acute stressor, it can actually increase or improve memory. And that's why, we remember like September 11th, the attacks on the Twin Towers.
I see. So something that's very emotionally charged, we're going to remember, but we might forget a person's name who we met.
Right.
So that person
Exactly.
who's always forgetting their grocery list, that would be a sign of sympathetic dominance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a good one right there, because initially you get a increased blood flow to the brain,
Sure.
but eventually it's going to decrease and you're going to get blood flow diverted to your skeletal muscles because you got to run from that tiger.
Yes, yeah, and that's my understanding of it from an evolutionary perspective. Is if our ancestors were going down to that watering hole and collecting water, and a tiger jumps out of the bushes, we get a strong rush of blood flow to those memory areas to make sure, hey, we look both directions and we're very careful next time we go down to that watering hole, if there's a next time.
Right.
But we're not going to remember that our wife told us to get the artichokes at the grocery store.
I think that's selective memory on your part.
I wasn't talking about a specific incident that happened earlier this week, Tim. So so a person might notice all of those things. The other thing that's interesting is I've seen long-term studies that show the same type of hippocampal shrinkage in people that are sedentary. So it's interesting, again, that we have that crossover where it's affecting the exact same regions of the brain.
Yeah, and I know your brother talks a lot about hormesis. I think that's his favorite word in the English language, hormesis. That was probably his first word, actually. But for the listeners who haven't heard the term, too much stress is obviously bad, but no stress. It's kind of like having a car that you never crank up and you live in a cold weather environment.
Sure.
When you do need to turn it on, it's not going to work. It's not going to fire.
Well, we should also differentiate between stress and eustress. So,
Yeah.
So healthy stressors or healthy amounts of stressors versus damaging stressors. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, so let's take heat, for example, like being in a sauna, far infrared sauna. Now, if you stay in too long, it's going to be perceived just as a bad stressor.
Sure.
But if you get in and, let's say you've never done it before, you do 15 to 20 minutes, then that's sort of, I call it priming the pump. It's working out your muscles so when you need them, that you can recover and regenerate. And so those hormetic stressors have positive adaptations after the fact that it influence our physiology in a positive manner. And so that can be, for sauna, there's a million benefits, but improved circulation, immune function, detoxification, improved mood, etc. Mitochondrial function.
Sure. Yeah. So with, first of all, I'll tell you what my brother's first word was when we were off the air, because it's not appropriate for the audience. But so just to recap on that, things that a person that might feel if they're in a sympathetic dominant state: dry eyes, dry mouth, forgetfulness, startle response. They're jumpy, sensitive to maybe noises or louder sounds. They're going to have sleep disturbance, difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep. And then even when they wake up in the morning, they are not going to feel rested.
That's right.
There will be an initial phase of time where they have more energy, which will transition to fatigue as time goes on. So all of those things, and then difficulty recovering. I mentioned dry eyes and dry mouth, I think. Okay.
Yeah.
So all of those things. So what is a person going to feel like when they're in a parasympathetic dominant state? What are some signs of that?
Usually a parasympathetic dominant state. So a situation would look like this for an individual. They have trouble getting motivated, getting off the couch. They can't make decisions. So there's some similarities between the signs and symptoms of sympathetic dominance and parasympathetic dominance.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Frequent infections is a sign of parasympathetic dominance as well. And parasympathetic dominance, you don't see a ton. I mean, you see degrees of it. But again, it's about having those hormetic stressors and priming the system so that it can switch back and forth as needed. A psychologist friend of mine said, Dr. Tim, I don't really worry about people when they have someone in their family or one of their friends die, because usually their support system rallies around them. I'm worried about the day in and day out low-level stressors that people don't come and put their arm around you and say it's going to be okay. And so, those accumulate over time. Sure. And obviously that triggers negative physiological consequences.
So that's interesting. So then a person who is isolated, as many of us have been socially isolated for the past year because of COVID, we would imagine particularly that situation has driven many people towards a sympathetic dominant state.
Oh, absolutely. And now I just saw an article earlier today on post-COVID. It wasn't talking about long COVID viral symptoms, but it was talking about the anxiety and depression after the fact. And my friends who work in the hospital system say, the two units that are overloaded are the cardiology unit, because people are having heart attacks and strokes from stress, and the psych units. So I have a patient who's a PhD psychologist, and she had no anxiety or depression before COVID. Huh. And then after COVID hit, she was severely affected.
Yeah, well, I know that sympathetic dominance is clearly tied to chronic pain situations. Chronic pain has direct links to anxiety and depression and sleep disorders. So a lot of these things are just interrelated like crazy, which is neat, because I always tell my patients, if we can positively affect any part of the cycle, then we've positively affected the entire cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So with that, so we've talked about some of the signs and symptoms of what a person would experience when they're in a sympathetic dominant state. We've talked about some of the things that a person would experience in a parasympathetic dominant state. So you mentioned kind of lethargic, difficulty making decisions. What other things would they feel? Any digestive symptoms? Would they have runny eyes because the other person had dry eyes?
Typically tear production would be normal.
Okay.
Usually doesn't become excessive, but it can.
Okay.
But frequent infections.
Okay.
And low mood, just like low mood across the board.
Like they don't get excited about stuff.
Right. You can say, you won $2 million. And they're like, okay, cool.
Huh. Interesting.
And so, that, and we'll get into this more in a minute, but the vagal tone. So the parasympathetic nervous system is very intimately associated with the vagus nerve.
Okay.
Or the wandering nerve. So, it starts up here and goes down and innervates our internal organs. And so it controls digestion, detoxification, and it can become, or it can develop decreased tone due to infections in the gut that infect the nerve. That's more of a hypothesis at the moment. But vagal tone, a lot of people make fun of yogis who are going, but that sound, that frequency is actually, and I forget the actual hertz, but I read it a long time ago, activates the vagus nerve. And so the vagus nerve is important for what's called the anti-inflammatory reflex.
Okay.
So we actually have a reflex that is intended to turn off inflammation and decrease it. Obviously inflammation in the short term helps us recover from an injury or a wound, but in the long term, it's deleterious.
Interesting. So we have signs and symptoms for sympathetic dominance. We have signs and symptoms for parasympathetic dominance, but the trend nowadays is towards the sympathetic side of the house. So we talked about the subjective things that a person would experience. What are some objective ways that a practitioner like yourself uses to say to a patient of yours with objective certainty, hey, you're in a sympathetic dominant state?
We can use something called heart rate variability.
Okay.
And so to define that for the listeners, basically it's counterintuitive, but we actually want a good bit of variation in minute to minute, the number of beats per minute.
Okay.
Because that indicates it's been positively associated with longevity, resilience, and it indicates that if heart rate variability is high, then more parasympathetic activity.
Okay.
If heart rate variability is very low,
okay,
that is characteristic of sympathetic overactivity.
Okay, let me just jump in and just clarify for the audience that the heart rate variability that we're talking about now is actually the period of milliseconds from one heartbeat to the next.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we have a high heart rate variability, it means we have more space between beats, which means less beats per minute, and that person is in a calmer, more parasympathetic state. If the heart rate variability is low, it means we're talking about a very short period of time. The beats are coming in faster, higher heart rate is trending towards sympathetic dominance, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So how do you recommend that the average person, what's the best way for them to get an idea of their heart rate variability?
There are so many apps out there now. Obviously there are wearable devices, but there are plenty of free apps. I don't recommend one over the other per se, but if I just give you an example, I saw advertised the other day for $99, you can get a little device that you plug into your phone and you can get an EKG.
Wow.
Readout. So to measure heart rate variability, plenty of apps to download and can help track that.
Okay.
I'd also like to refer people to the Heart Math Institute.
Okay, great.
And so they've done tons of studies. That's all they do on heart rate variability and what we call coherence,
Okay.
which is basically synchronicity between the brain and the heart.
Very interesting. So that's a Heart Math Institute. So we're checking for heart rate variability. Is there some kind of a standard, like a number that we're looking for that one says to us sympathetic and one says to us parasympathetic, or is there a variance between individuals?
I think when I was researching it, I think there's a lot of variability from one individual to the next.
Okay.
Because I tried looking for charts and studies that had charts with data that showed what numbers would be healthy for parasympathetic and unhealthy for sympathetic, or something of that nature, and I couldn't find any standard across the board.
Okay, so is it just more of like a body weight type thing, where like wherever you're starting from, you want to see it trending in the direction of higher heart rate variability?
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And
so
sorry, is it something that you measure every day, or is it something that you measure once a week, or how do you recommend doing that?
So you want to measure it every day. The more data points, the better, basically.
What's the best time of day to measure?
So I would say, be consistent with
Okay.
your measurement time, but, once in the morning, once in the middle afternoon, once in the early evening.
Okay.
And so, any time that, fits into those parameters, I think is good, but at minimum 3 times a day. And, if someone wants to invest in a wearable device that can measure heart rate variability, they'll obviously get a huge data file that shows peaks and valleys, throughout the day. And maybe they can say, oh yeah, that's when I had that meeting on Tuesday, to sort of provoke that stressor.
Yeah, I think some of those smart rings are measuring heart rate variability at this point. But my understanding is that the most accurate way of doing it is one of the chest straps, like the ones from Polar.
Yeah. So I used to have a Polar strap. I probably still have it somewhere, but the Aura ring. The Aura ring really gives you more information than a sleep study. To be honest, I don't own one, so I don't have a dog in the fight. But everyone I know who does, they just love it.
Okay. So heart rate variability, they're measuring it every single day, and they're looking as they incorporate some of the things that we're talking about, whether that's physical activity incorporation or making sure that they're in bed and getting 8 hours before 10:30 in the evening. What are some other things that a person can do if they find that they're in a sympathetic dominance and they have low heart rate variability when they're measuring? What are some things that they can do to push themselves in the direction of balance or towards parasympathetic?
Yeah, so I have my little TENS unit here,
Okay.
my transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, but it's not used in the traditional sense. So we're not going to be using the pads or the sticky pads. Instead, we have ear clips that go on the end of the wires. And I think I can do this with my earpiece in, but the red piece should go here. And where did it go? Here's the black. Should go on the earlobe. And so I learned this from studying a number of different research studies and talking to a number of different doctors.
So it's on your left ear. Can you bring your ear real close to the camera so people can see where you got it? Okay.
Yeah. And so the setting, and I recommend, if people are really toxic, they haven't, worked in functional medicine or been on the health path that long or wellness path, start with just 5 minutes to assess your response.
Okay.
And then you can modify from there. And the settings, would you like for me to go through the settings real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can show the TENS unit to the screen so that we can.
So you can see here, the rate is 5 hertz.
So the rate is 5 hertz.
What's called the width is 250 microseconds.
Okay.
So it'll be a little U with a line at the first part of the U.
Okay.
And that is indicative of microseconds.
Okay.
And then the wavelength type, or the type of wavelength, you want to be normal.
Okay.
So those are the primary settings. And then when you turn it on, so I could plug this wire into either channel.
Okay.
And then I turn on the respective button, and you start by gradually increasing the number until you feel a tingling. So it should not be painful. And one thing I wanted to add in, you cannot do this if you have a pacemaker or a similar type device.
Okay.
It's just too risky.
Okay.
But so you want to gradually increase this until you feel a slight tingling.
Okay.
And the time that we use, I have people start with 5 minutes.
Okay.
And build up to, like, now I'm at the point where I do an hour twice a day.
Wow.
And that's the recommendation, at least how I learned it. And so, you can do it and put it on while you're working and put this in your pocket. People usually ask me what the heck I have on. But you can put this in your pocket, go for a walk,
Okay.
like a nice slow walk,
Okay.
and definitely, increase the vagus nerve. And so one thing I wanted to touch on is the vagus nerve helps to calm down inflammation, but it also improves mood
Okay.
and brain activity. So your thinking becomes clearer. And the study wasn't done with this device. It was another device that hasn't come out yet. But when they went across the vagus nerve at the points where they could access it, women had spontaneous orgasms.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't believe it when I first read it, but I've talked to several people and the study seems legit. I couldn't poke holes in it. But the point being is that we talked about parasympathetic nervous system being the feed and breathe.
Okay.
And I tell my male patients, you can't have an erection when you're running from a tiger.
Okay.
So, all that to say, having a balanced nervous system and good parasympathetic tone is necessary for a good mood, healthy brain activity, healthy heart rate, and reproduction.
Very interesting. So one more time, the settings are 5 hertz?
5 hertz, and you can start a little lower, say even 2 hertz,
Okay.
if you want.
Okay, so we could start them at 2 hertz at 250 microseconds. We're using only one channel with ear clips and a TENS unit. The red channel goes to the front of the ear, and the black channel goes to the bottom of the lobe, and we're doing the left side only, correct?
Correct, left side only.
And we're starting people at 5 minutes.
Mhm.
And you're building what, you're adding 5 minutes a week, something like that?
Yeah, so if you're someone who's really sensitive to, say, supplements, adjustments, exercise, things like that, then you might want to increase by, say, 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay.
Each day or each time.
So take it real slow.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And you're building up to a max of 1 hour, and absolutely not for anybody with a pacemaker.
Correct. And you can do up to 1 hour twice a day.
Okay. And what might a person notice? Say we have a person who's sympathetic dominance and they start doing this technique with the TENS unit on their left ear. What types of things might they notice from that?
I immediately noticed feeling calmer.
Okay.
And then one way I knew it was working is that I would have a bowel movement at the end of each session.
Wow.
And so, again, rest and digest.
Sure.
Feed and breathe. And so, the improved mood, increased resilience, things would just roll off my back that would normally bother me.
Interesting.
And decreased inflammation.
Okay.
So, I don't personally have pain, but after a workout, if I've lifted really heavy, then this can help me with recovery and regeneration.
Very interesting. And have you tested with objective measurements of heart rate variability, this technique?
I have not. I've just gone by strictly subjective indicators.
Yeah.
And, I love objective data myself, but personally, at the end of the day, I want to feel different.
Sure. And you're using this technique with your patients.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. What's something else that a person can do in addition to this TENS unit? And you're saying they're very inexpensive, like $30.
$30, and with the ear clips, that's an extra $9. So about $40.
Okay.
That's the total. And again, they'll probably go down even cheaper.
Okay.
Than that.
Is there a brand that you recommend?
This is the TENS 7000.
Okay.
That's the unit.
Okay.
And when you go to the website, you can type in ear clips and it'll bring up the exact ones you need. And as far as, something that's completely free that you can do, that it has a ton of research behind it, are cold face plunges.
Okay.
So people have heard of cryotherapy. They've heard of cold water immersion, where, you're getting in an entire bathtub and submerging your body. But you can simply have a pan or bowl that's big enough to contain your face and have a mixture of cold water and ice. And typically the parameters, you want the water to be between 38 and 45 degrees, no more than 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this is activating something called the diver's reflex.
Okay.
And so if you look at divers who are doing free dives where they don't have an oxygen tank, it allows them to hold their breath for longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you dip your face into the cold water and cold ice, you obviously are holding your breath, and you can take breaks, as you're building up your endurance. But doing that first thing in the morning, it helps to basically activate or rebalance, recalibrate the autonomic nervous system so that you're ready to take on the day. And it also stimulates wakefulness and cognitive alertness.
Yeah. Putting yourself in 40-degree, or putting your face in 40-degree water, definitely going to wake you up.
Yeah, exactly.
So you had mentioned earlier, also you touched on it just for a second, sauna for stimulating parasympathetic state.
Yeah.
And then you also had mentioned really briefly alternate nostril breathing. Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, so and I'm sure there's a lot more science to it than I've gone into, but basically, a slow walk is not going to activate, the sympathetic aspect of the nervous system. But when you add in the alternate nostril breathing, it just sort of makes you focus on internal processes. And anytime you focus on your breathing, and improving it in terms of not having frequent short shallow breaths, that's going to improve your overall health and tone of your nervous system.
Awesome. And can you demonstrate alternate nostril breathing so that
so basically I'm going to block one nostril, take a deep breath in, brief hold, and I'm going to switch.
Okay. So you're inhaling while having a blocked nostril and then exhaling through the mouth.
Yeah, and studies have shown that there's no benefit to exhaling longer than you inhale.
Okay.
There's just as much benefit from having a 4-second inhale and a 4-second exhale.
Okay, so specifically we're working on while we're walking, we're going to block one nostril. We're going to inhale, make sure that inhalation lasts 4 full seconds. Then we're going to hold for what period of time?
So I tell people 2 seconds.
Okay, so a 4-second inhalation, a 2-second hold, and then a 4-second exhalation while the nostril stays blocked through the mouth. And then we switch over to the opposite side and repeat while we're walking.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
Exactly.
Well, that's awesome. Well, this is great, Tim. I really appreciate you taking the time today. It's been a ton of really good information. Can you just tell my audience where they can reach you?
Sure. So my website is healyourbody.org.
Okay.
Or healyourbody.org. Okay. And they can click contact on there and the message will shoot right over to me.
Great. And you work with patients remotely, correct?
Yeah, I work remotely with patients from all over the world.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, you guys. Check out Dr. Tim Jackson, healyourbody.org, and really appreciate it, Tim. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this interview and that you'll put Dr. Jackson's information to good use. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on the new videos that I put out each week, where I give you the tools to break free of pain and achieve the best posture and mobility of your life. And if you're struggling with chronic pain, you've got to check out my Pain Fix Protocol. This is the new science for permanently breaking free of long-standing pain conditions. I'm going to include links for contacting Dr. Jackson, for the TENS unit that he recommended, as well as for the Pain Fix Protocol in the link down below. And we'll see you guys next week.